All right, so if you were jamming along to the previous video, you'd know exactly what I've done in the background. But if not, for a quick recap, ever since we created those three blocks together in the last video, I kind of went ahead and created a few more that we would use for models moving forward. Nothing special about them. I've just created a simple model for an image, a video, a CTA, a newsletter sign up, which are often things you would see yourself embedding in different pieces of content, like a blog post or within a landing page. I've also created a block for a hero, which has a layout that has the headline, description, image, and the possibility to add a few other blocks within it, such as the logo reel and the CTA and so on. And another few simple ones like an FAQ and a content block and a statistic. This one would be particularly useful for things like case studies, which is one of the models we'd be building. So now that we have these blocks in place, maybe let's go ahead and build out some very common models that we'd see on most B2B or SaaS websites. So I'm thinking we could go ahead and make something like a person that utilizes the testimonial and the contact info block that we created. We could even go ahead and create one for a blog post. So when we're creating content later on, we can see exactly how all the fields work for us. And let's create something else for a case study, since we've already created the blocks for testimonials and statistics. And maybe one just for a very sort of drag and drop experience on a simple landing page. So if we go ahead and create one for a person, sorry, not an author, since we've earlier established that a person could be an author or a customer or an external person, we can go ahead and create one that's just a person. In the settings field, we'll keep a sort of draft and publish system. What this means is whenever we create content and save it, by default, it's kept as a draft, and we can go ahead and then change its workflow stage to that of published when we want it to be queried on the front end, depending on kind of how our project is built. In this case, we don't need all locales because a person's name wouldn't change based on the language, so we can go ahead and leave this as is. I won't go into too much detail on the compact and tabular view. This is something that's a lot more easier to look at once we reach the content editing stage to kind of see how everything's laid out. So let's just go ahead and leave it as a tabular view for now. And we can also keep it on default ordering. So here you can kind of have a field within a model on how you want it to show up in the content view, or you can have a drag and drop, which is particularly useful for things like case studies if you want them to show up in a specific order, or you can have them as a tree, which is kind of a hierarchy on how you would want them to show. So let's just go ahead with the default ordering for now. And on the presentation side, we'll keep these as they are. So the title field is something that we could eventually set when we create a field within here, such as the name. We could even have an image preview for how it would be shown within the table view, and what an excerpt would be for a fallback for when we have SEO fields. So let's just go ahead and create this person view and start adding fields. Now, every person has a name for which we'll go ahead and add a single line string like we've established. This is not a field, this is not a model that needs localization. So let's go ahead and save this. We can also add a few simple text fields for things like the person's title or the person's company, depending on what we use this for. And since we've already created blocks for contact info and for testimonials, we actually don't need to create these fields in this model anymore. We can just go ahead, create either a modular content field that lists out these two blocks, which is what we'll do in this case, and will allow us to have multiple blocks. So let's just go ahead and call this info for now. And under validations, this is where we would look for contact info and for the testimonial. And once we have this in place, we can go ahead and save this. And we have our person model ready for us. So what would a person typically do inside the CMS? They'd probably create some blog posts where we would need a relation to a person as an author. So let's maybe go ahead and create a new model for a blog post. Need an icon here. And this would be also on the draft and publish system, but we maybe wouldn't want all locales required. It's quite possible a blog post may exist in 2 or more languages, but it may not always be relevant. So let's just go ahead and leave things as they are and go ahead and save this. Now, for the model, what we could do is either provide a title and a description as individual fields, or if we're relatively certain that we would have the same format for our blog post as all other landing pages, we can just go ahead and use the block that we created for a hero. In this case, maybe we want to keep it a little more specific. So let's go ahead and create a title for us. And we'll also go ahead and create a structured text field for the description in case we want to add any specific styling and things like this. We'll also add another structured text field for the actual content of the post itself. But what's cool here is when we reach the validations, this is where we can start to see the usage of these blocks within the structured text field. So if you remember, I'd created a few blocks for things like the images and videos and so on. And it's quite likely we'd want content like this within our blog posts. So let's go ahead and make sure that these are enabled for us. Here we would want the image, we would want the video. Is there anything else we would possibly want within a blog post? Maybe something like a newsletter sign up, a testimonial if we want to add a few quotes, and maybe a statistic if we're talking about some research that we did for any of these blog posts. We could then go ahead and save this field. And once we have this in place, we're pretty much ready to go. Except, maybe I'm forgetting something. Right. On the settings, if you remember what we had in the beginning on the presentation, title has already been enabled for us because we had a title field created as the first string. And here, now that we have a blog post, we can also go ahead and set the featured image to show up as a preview. And that is what I'd forgotten. So let's go back, add a single asset for the featured image and save the field. And now we can go ahead and sort of add this for the featured image. Since we already have an asset field within this model, it's been inherited as the image preview field. Now, we'd also created one for a description, which we can use for the excerpt and as an SEO fallback. So let's go ahead and save this. Now, normally this would look complete as a blog post, but we're missing something very critical since on blocks, we haven't used the SEO field much. But since we're using the models for pages and posts, this is where SEO becomes incredibly important. So if you remember, we had two flavors of the SEO field. One was to generate slugs, which is what every blog post would have. And the other one was for things like the OG tags and the previews. So for a blog post, I would say that both are extremely relevant. So maybe let's go ahead and first create a slug. Now, here we would want localizations because we would have a different slug for different languages depending on how our content is structured. And within validations, we could automatically generate a slug based on the title field. We don't need to change anything here since the slug would match its own pattern, but we do want this field to be required and unique. So let's go ahead and save this and now add in the SEO and social. So we're just going to call this socials for now. Also enable localizations if we want a different version to show up for different languages. And let's not keep this required because we're probably going to have a lot of fallbacks coming in. But for the presentation, we definitely want to see the option of having no index in case we create a few blog posts we don't want showing up on search results. We'll just keep everything enabled for visible previews. I don't see any reason to not show us all of these moving forward. So let's go ahead and save this. And just like that, we have a model for our blog post created. Now, this is me coming back several days later to rectify a very important mistake that I made. Since we've created the blog post model, of course, every blog post would have an author associated to it. But given that we've already created a model for a person, we don't actually need to add fields into the blog post for things like the author's name, their bio, their avatar, and so on. All we could do is simply add a new field and link to an existing model. Since we only want to reference the model for the person and nothing else, we can go ahead and choose a single link, call it an author, and under validations, make sure that we're only accepting the person model as part of the blog post. Since we want to make sure that all posts have an author associated, we can go ahead and make this a required field. However, since multiple blog posts can be written by the same author, we don't need to select a unique field. And then we can go ahead and save this to finally complete the model for a blog post before moving on. Finally, let's maybe go ahead and create a page. So we said we would create a case study together to sort of use the the blocks that we created earlier on. So let's give this the emoji. Let's also keep the draft and publish system. Let's maybe not keep locales required again, because we'd probably just create these in English. So let's go ahead and save this, and let's add in a field for the title. And we'd want something here that would probably be a description and a CTA. So let's go ahead and add another description here utilizing the multiple paragraph text. And we can go ahead and now start creating the actual template for the case study itself. So we had created multiple blocks. Let's go ahead and call this content. And here we could look at what's relevant for a case study. So a content block is something I'd kind of created beforehand, which just had the ability to have a simple text and image layout side by side. Very relevant for case studies. There might be FAQs that come up from any questions and answers that we're addressing. We'd probably want images. We definitely want videos. We'd have testimonials, and we would have statistics. So here we can have any of these come in and save the field for our content. Finally, we might want to have a reference, in this case, to a specific person. Like we'd said before, people can be either authors or customers, and we'd eventually want to attribute any content that's related to testimonials and quotes on this specific model to the right person. So let's go ahead and add a link to a single record. We'll just call this a person, and have this linked to the applicable model. And finally, very similar to what we did with the blog posts, we'd want to have a slug from the title, which is required and unique. And we would also want to have the SEO and social aspects here with the options all enabled. And there we have it. We have case studies in place. Now, finally, let's go ahead and create a very simple landing page model. And I'm going to call this a single instance model. A single instance model is one that you can only create once. So perhaps landing page is the wrong name to go with. Let's go with something like an about page. You're not going to have more than one on your website. So this is where you would use a single instance, where you can manage the content and sort of structure the page exactly as you want, but you would only be able to create one and not create a collection of these. So let's go ahead and keep everything as is. Maybe for this one, we'll make sure that all locales are required. So in the editing workflow, we can see what errors we get when we don't create content in Italian and in German as well. And we'll go ahead and save this. Finally, let's just zip through this with, well, localizations will have to be enabled. We'll have a title, and then we'll go ahead and just have a modular content field with all of the possible blocks and call it content. So this will be particularly useful for us moving forward to see how kind of the drag and drop or the template page builder format works when creating landing pages such as the about page. So over here, we would definitely want the contact info because we'd have addresses and people to contact us. A few content blocks, a few CTAs, maybe some FAQs about our operating hours and so on. A hero. I don't see the need for a standalone image. We would need our logo reel, maybe a sign up for our newsletter, and probably a few testimonials. And once we have that in place, we would be able to create our page. So let's go ahead and save it. And finally, before we forget, just make sure that we have the slug field in place, which is required, and we would use the title. Maybe for this, we wouldn't want any social media previews, so we can look at how a fallback would work, since Dato also has the option to set SEO fallbacks for the entire project. So let's go ahead and save this now. What we've done is create models using brand new fields, as well as some of the blocks we'd created earlier for a person, which is linked to both a blog post and a case study. And we've also created an about page using the modular content field to kind of see what the drag and drop functionality would be. So let's stop here since this is already quite a bit to digest. And very similar to blocks, I'm going to go ahead and create a few more models for other landing pages, for things like the header and so on that we would need across the project. But I'll follow the same format. I'll throw on some lo-fi. You can just watch that at your own pace if you'd like. If not, I'll see you in the next chapter where we're going to go straight into the actual content editing itself.